Hello, listen carefully. My name is Larry, and I'm going to tell you what happened during a game I once decided to play with my friends. This game was called the Midnight Game. We chose an old, abandoned psychiatric clinic as our playing field, one known as Hammond Ward. The ones playing were me and my friends, Carlton, Josie, Greg, and Benny. The initiator, of course, was Benny. He was fascinated by the occult, and when he heard about an urban legend, he immediately wanted to test it for himself. But to do that, he needed to gather for more people. Naturally, he pitched the idea to his close friends. 5 12-year-old kids playing some kind of occult ritual, what could possibly go wrong? When Benny asked me to join, at first I thought it was a joke. But he insisted. I agreed because I was sure it would be fun. Benny and I had already tried playing Bloody Mary, but nothing happened. We had also searched for ghosts in abandoned buildings, but aside from homeless people, we never found anything. Benny continued to believe that all supernatural things were real. I, on the other hand, thought this was just another failed adventure like all the previous ones. How wrong I was. When we arrived at the location, Benny explained the rules of the game. It was a little-known urban legend that claimed there were things beyond our perception, and they could only be communicated with through certain rituals. The Midnight Game required 5 participants. Each participant had to sit in a circle with a lit candle. If someone's candle went out, they had to relight it as quickly as possible. At some point, it was allowed to leave the circle but not the playing field. Another important rule: the Midnight Game had to be played in a place that had experienced great suffering. Benny didn't have to search long for a suitable location. This psychiatric clinic, with its chilling history, was the perfect choice. Mistreatment of patients, lobotomy experiments, everything you could imagine from the most terrifying nightmares or horror films. Benny had even taken me there once before trying to find ghosts. But as always, we found nothing. Despite that, the place was eerie. The walls were covered in drawn pentagrams and inverted crosses. Empty bottles and other strange artifacts were scattered around. I realized we weren't the first ones here. This place didn't need ghosts to make you feel true terror. Trust me on that. Benny told us one more important rule of the Midnight Game: not to utter a single word. We weren't allowed to speak for an entire hour. To keep track of time, Greg set a timer on his phone. Benny led us into one of the smaller rooms. This was where we were supposed to play. I asked why here, and he said it was better this way when there's only one door. I was about to ask how he knew all these details, but he beat me to it, saying he had read it on some internet forum. I rolled my eyes and was ready to leave, but I didn't, because I didn't want to look like a coward in front of my friends, especially in front of Josie. We sat in a circle and handed out candles to each other. Each one was unique. Mine was long, thin, and red. Josie's was orange and full-bodied. Benny's was black and cylindrical. Greg's was yellow, and Carlton's was green. Before we began, Benny explained another important rule. We must light the candles in a clockwise direction. Before midnight, he said, glancing at his watch. Benny lit his candle first. 1 hour, he said. 1 hour of your time. That's all we ask. Then I lit mine, followed by Josie, Greg, and Carlton. Once all the candles were burning, Benny reached out his hands toward us. We hold hands, he said, demonstrating that we were united. I felt a little silly, but it was nice that Josie was holding my hand. Carlton grumbled something under his breath before grabbing Benny's hand. Then Benny continued, "We, the 5 of us, want to play with you. 5 people with 5 candles. We want to play the Midnight Game. Do you want to play with us?" Silence. Absolute silence. That was Benny's answer. I opened my mouth, wanting to say how ridiculous this was, but then I realized just how quiet everything was. I took a deep breath, feeling the air rush into my throat, but I heard nothing. I tapped my foot lightly against the floor. Still, no sound. A cold fear curled in my stomach. I looked at Benny, but he seemed mesmerized by the candle flame. "If you want to play," he said, "give us a sign." His voice was the only thing breaking the silence. I looked at Josie. Her lips moved as if she were speaking, but no sound came out. I glanced at Carlton and Greg. They had the same expression as I did. "Give us a sign," Benny suddenly repeated, this time almost demanding, though there was no real force behind his voice. He was desperate, hoping this wouldn't be meaningless, that his fascination with the occult wouldn't end in disappointment, that he could prove to himself and to us that this was real. I think that's what was going through his head at that moment. But nothing happened. We sat there, holding our breath, unsure of what we had gotten ourselves into. Benny sighed, opened his mouth to say something, but I saw the disappointment in his eyes. I wondered if he had noticed just how eerily silent it was. And then, all at once, a gust of wind blew out the black cylindrical candle in front of Benny. He froze, staring at the smoke rising from the extinguished wick. Then, quickly, he pulled out a match and relit it. His face lit up with a grin as he turned to us. The disappointment vanished, replaced by an almost euphoric excitement. He didn't realize the full gravity of what had just happened. "The game is starting, guys," he said. 3, 2, 1. All of our candles went out at the same time. I rushed to relight mine, but I didn't even notice that the silence had vanished. Only when I looked down at my candle, watching red wax drip down its side, did I realize that I could hear my friends breathing again. I lifted my gaze and looked at each of them. They were just as confused as I was, except for Benny. I wanted to say something, to ask, but then I remembered Benny's warning. "We cannot speak until something begins." Would I risk breaking that rule? Of course not. A voice broke the silence, but it didn't belong to any of us. "What do we have here?" it said softly, like a child. Another voice, identical to the first, replied, "Players of the Midnight Game." "It's been so long since I've seen players of the Midnight Game. What a joy," a third voice said. "It's been so long since I've played this game," added a fourth. "What are we supposed to do?" asked a fifth. "Come, I'll show you," came the response. I didn't even breathe, wondering if I had imagined those voices. I glanced at Benny, whose eyes were wide with excitement and shock. "What the hell?" Carlton suddenly said, breaking the silence. "Screw this. I'm leaving." He muttered something under his breath, and as I watched in stunned silence, seeing him attempt to stand up, I noticed dents on the shoulders of his coat, like thin, pencil-like fingers pressing into the fabric. "What the hell?" Carlton whispered, his voice trembling. I scanned the filthy room. My friends had the same wide-eyed expression as me. Benny was staring at the wall, or at least it seemed that way. I wanted to ask him what he was doing, but then my candle flickered out. I quickly struck a match and relit it, then turned back to Benny. He was no longer looking at the wall. He was staring straight at the flame. His face had gone pale. For a brief moment, his wet eyes lifted and met mine. He didn't need to say a word to express his regret, and I shared it. A creaking sound came from outside, and we all turned toward the door. It was sharp, painful, metallic, stretching out across the entire clinic. With each second, it grew closer and closer. We waited, tense, expecting some horror to pass by the doorway. A rusted, empty wheelchair appeared in the threshold and stopped. Slowly, it turned toward us, its crooked wheels scraping against the floor. The left front wheel suddenly rolled forward, the right one twitching as it slowly inched into the room, crossed the doorway and then halted. "What's happening?" Carlton said, and the dents on his shoulders deepened. "Hush," a voice suddenly whispered. "Hush, you wouldn't want to wake them, would you?" "Wake who? We can wake someone?" What kind of bullshit is this? I asked. The voice continued, They are not awake yet. If they wake up, you all lose. Now hold your candles tightly. Get on your feet. It's time to play the midnight game. You know the goal, don't you? Don't wake them. A pause. Then the voice continued. And that's when I couldn't help but notice the tension in the dents on Carlton's shoulders. If they wake up, then we win. I darted a glance at my friends, then turned to Carlton. They're already stirring, but they're not awake yet. Best if none of you speak until the game is over, right? Yes. But the question is, can you keep from screaming? Carlton couldn't. He reached out, but something suddenly yanked him backward into the darkness, and he vanished. I almost screamed, but Benny lifted his hand, holding his candle high, and aimed the flame into the darkness. Carlton reappeared. His face was sunken, drained. His hair had turned gray. His eyes were wide, empty. His whole body trembled. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. One player, the fifth voice said, has lost the midnight game. A soft giggle echoed from the other four voices. Then all five spoke at once. Well then, now only four remain. Nobody knew what had just happened to Carlton, and nobody wanted to know. One look at his exhausted face was enough to send a chill down my spine. And the voices were still speaking in unison. For remain. For remain. They repeated it over and over. I covered my ears with my hands, trying to block out the noise. But then, my candle went out. I immediately tried to relight it, but I felt something touch my hand. My eyes snapped upward, and I found myself staring into Josie's face. She was in a panic, pointing toward the door. Just as I struck a match, I heard it. Someone groaning. A deep, guttural, wild groan. A man's groan. The voices fell silent for a brief moment. Interesting, said the fifth voice. It seems there's someone else here. Not a player. Silence stretched for a few seconds. Then, from behind the door, came the sound of shattering glass. Benny, Greg, Josie. I looked at her. A discarded bottle slowly lifted into the air, supported by invisible hands that left behind thin, pencil-like imprints in the dust. Run, said the fifth voice. Then the bottle shot forward and crashed violently to the ground, shattering into pieces. The glass glinted in the moonlight, and then a blood-curdling scream. I barely remember grabbing my candle and bolting out of the room. Josie was the first to rush through the doorway. I followed. Together, we shoved the wheelchair aside, toppled over with a loud crash, one of its wheels cracking. Shards of glass crunched under my boots and my friend's boots. Heavy footsteps thundered down the corridor, coming straight toward us, accompanied by terrible, guttural screams. I barely held back the urge to scream myself. None of my friends screamed either. I wanted to call out, to ask them to wait for me. But then, I felt heavy breathing, right against my ear. I froze. Turning my head, I saw it. Carlton's thin, pale face. He was following me. His white hair starkly contrasted against the darkness around us. His eyes were hollow, empty, staring straight ahead. He clutched an unlit candle to his chest. He passed right by me without even glancing in my direction, moving as if gliding down the corridor before colliding with the wall. My candle slipped from my grip and hit the ground. Its flame snuffed out. I bent down, grabbed it, and quickly relit it, just as something else fell to the floor. I turned, and my heart nearly stopped. Benny had tripped over the overturned wheelchair. He dropped his candle. The wick had burned, but it wasn't relit. A wisp of smoke curled into the air. Benny reached for the black candle. Glass crunched beneath him. Several shards lodged into his palm, and blood trickled down, coating the candle as he slowly pulled himself up. The pounding footsteps were nearly upon us. I lunged toward Benny to help him up, but suddenly, the candle slipped from his grasp and rolled across the floor. Then it stopped, and slowly, it lifted into the air. Benny was already on his feet. He caught it midair and fumbled for a match. Eyes wide, I stared down the corridor, toward the far end, toward the corner, the one the footsteps were now rounding. No, one of the voices said. He mustn't. Rules, the fifth voice spoke. Must be followed, not broken. But how can we win without a little cheating? A massive, towering figure with a wild mane of hair emerged from around the corner. The piercing screams morphed into a beastly howl. I lunged forward, grabbed Benny's arm, and yanked him along with me. He broke free and ran beside me. The howling behind us grew closer. The corridor split into 3 different paths, not counting the one we were already on. I glanced at Benny and pointed to the right, then at him. Keep running. We were so in sync that Benny didn't need me to repeat myself. As soon as we reached the intersection, he turned right, and I followed. I slipped on a discarded bottle, nearly crashing to the ground, barely keeping my balance. Benny skidded to a halt, eyes wide, ready to help me, but I raised a hand. The howls were nearly upon us. Without thinking, I bolted in the opposite direction. I looked back. Benny was staring at me with an expression of pity before dashing the other way. Then, his path was blocked by the hulking figure. Chased me down the dark corridor. It pursued me relentlessly through the entire asylum, never stopping the chase. I don't know how I managed to escape, but I dove beneath the broken doors hanging limply from their frames. I swear, I could feel its hot breath on my neck, but it never managed to grab me. I knew that if its hands wrapped around my throat, I was done for. I rounded a corner and stumbled into an abandoned room. The screams began to fade into the distance. I kept running, ignoring the burning in my lungs, desperate to find a place to hide. I shoved open a set of double doors and found myself in what must have once been a kitchen. I stopped. Knives, covered in dark rust. Spatulas, large serving spoons. Other kitchen utensils I couldn't name if my life depended on it. Frantically, I scanned the room for a hiding spot. I yanked open an old refrigerator and barely held back the bile rising in my throat. Inside were the rotting remains of a rat, its body writhing with greasy, squirming maggots. Instinctively, I slammed the door shut. "Where are you?" A guttural growl rumbled from just beyond the double doors, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. I cursed myself for being so careless. The footsteps drew closer, accompanied by more growling, low, unintelligible muttering. I whipped my head around, spotted a cabinet, and shoved myself inside. My candle was my only source of light. As the footsteps neared, I peered through the small gap in the cabinet door. Candlelight spilled through the crack. Without thinking, I blew out the flame and fumbled in my pocket for matches. Then the doors slammed open. I froze. A deep, guttural voice muttered something incoherent. Heavy footsteps stomped through the kitchen, knocking over everything in their path. Something crashed. A door banged shut. Curled up inside the cramped cabinet, my body ached with discomfort. My back screamed in protest. The footsteps continued their slow, menacing journey across the kitchen. Glass crunched. A wisp of smoke rose from the long, thin candle still clutched in my hand. Then, the footsteps stopped. A shadow loomed in front of the cabinet door. The incoherent mumbling took on a more aggressive, threatening tone. I didn't need to see his face to know. This man was unhinged. Something rustled. The shadow shifted. Through the crack, I saw his bare, filthy foot. His toenails yellowed and thick with fungus. Then the other foot came into view. Both feet turned and stopped right in front of my hiding place. The muttering was replaced by a long, deep sniff. Then, a loud thud against the cabinet. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. A second thud. Then another. And another. The cabinet shook with each violent strike. The thing outside was pounding against it, howling with rage. Tears streamed down my face. This is where I die, I thought. Then, the pounding stopped. The howls ceased. I strained my ears. A metallic creak. A door slamming shut. Shuffling footsteps. The yellowed, claw-like nails dragged across the floor, then faded into the distance. I waited until the muttering disappeared along with them. Slowly, I pulled out a match, struck it, and held the flame to the wick of my candle. Relief washed over me as the fire flickered to life. I exhaled shakily and blew out the match. Then the cupboard door slowly opened and stopped halfway. The dust on the inside of the door was smudged in places, leaving thin, pencil-like marks. I held my breath. The door swung open completely, shuddering. However, it didn't slam shut. It stopped just a centimeter from the cupboard and then closed all the way. I jumped and dropped the candle when my phone buzzed in my pocket. Instantly, I grabbed the candle before the flame could go out, brought it to my face, and pulled out my phone. A message had arrived. We made a group chat to make it easier to talk, but I didn't feel any relief when I saw Josie's message. In fact, what she had sent made my blood run cold. Guys, I'm in the basement, and I think I hear something. I was the first to reply. 3 little dots danced in the text field. Then her response came, I can't. Something is blocking the door upstairs. I hear one of the voices. It's whispering above. I think it's singing. I swallowed hard as another message came in. This time from Benny. Josie, I'll try to help you. Greg, Larry, are you with Carlton? Greg was the first to reply. I thought he was with one of you guys. My heart leaped into my throat, and I frowned as I typed. Guys, Carlton isn't with me. The text field with the little dots disappeared for a few seconds. Just as I saw Benny start typing, it happened. A sharp scraping sound tore through the air, like stones being dragged across a metal floor. The entire building started to shake and sway. This didn't feel like an earthquake. It was something else. Felt like the asylum was moving. A voice whispered right beside my ear. Then Josie sent another message. Guys, something's wrong. Something is really wrong. I'm not alone. I'm scared. I hear someone screaming. I don't think it's human. Benny, why the hell did you convince us to play this game? I barely started typing a reply before the tremors stopped. A sickly green light seeped through the cracks of the cupboard. Phones buzzed again. A new message, this time from Benny. Guys, he began, I'm looking out the window, and I don't think we're on Earth anymore. Not on Earth anymore? What the hell? How could we not be on Earth? I sent that to Greg. His response made my hands tremble even more. Guys, I see a green light outside. There's something really bright, like a glowing sphere in the sky. Josie was the first to reply. Bullshit. What sphere? Are you hallucinating? What the hell is happening? Benny, you son of a bitch. You didn't tell us this game could do something like this. I didn't know. I didn't want this to happen. Whatever it is, whoever it is, it's playing with us, Benny wrote. Greg's next message shut down Benny and Josie's argument. Guys, yeah, this is freaky, but we need to focus on getting out of here. Listen, we have about an hour, but we still need to find Carlton. What else do you remember about the rules of the midnight game? I can't, guys. Sorry, I didn't really prepare. I just skimmed the rules, Benny admitted. Greg jumped back in. We need to stick together. Josie, you said you're in the basement, right? I'll try to get there and help you. Benny, Larry, try to find Carlton. We'll meet back in the room where all of this started. Okay, but what about the lunatic? I asked. I waited anxiously for a reply. Greg was the only one who responded. I don't know. Just try to avoid him. All right. Does everyone have a plan? A flood of affirmative messages followed. Okay, good luck, guys, I typed. Stay safe. I waited for a few minutes, but no new messages popped up in the group chat. That left me with one option. I carefully nudged the door open with my foot. The entire kitchen was bathed in an eerie, painful-to-look-at green light pouring in from outside. I couldn't stop myself from glancing out the window toward the source. There, high above us in the dark sky, something really was glowing like a burning sphere. The landscape outside was almost identical to the one we had passed through to reach Hammond's ward. There were trees, grass, and flowers, but everything looked gray, barren, and lifeless. I had to shove my phone into my pocket when I picked up a knife from the floor. If nothing else, I needed to convince myself that I could fight back against whatever we were dealing with. The knife was covered in rust, the handle worn down. Part of the blade was jagged, serrated in places. I slowly pushed the kitchen door open, picturing a massive human figure waiting on the other side, its hands reaching for my throat. But nothing. No one was there. Just an empty hallway, its walls covered in spray paint, with the nauseating green light shining from outside. Fear, fear, fear. A voice whispered right beside my ear. Something brushed through my hair. Every cell in my body screamed at me to run and never stop, but I couldn't force myself to move an inch. I was frozen like a statue. A distant, inhuman howl echoed down the hall. That snapped me out of it. Molten wax dripped onto my skin, but I didn't care. I walked slowly down the corridor, gripping the knife in my shaking hand. I stepped carefully, trying to make no noise at all. The only sound I could hear was my own breathing, echoing against the walls around me. I stopped. My breathing grew faster. The voice whispered, "Fear, fear, fear. We are your fear." And in that moment, my candle went out. I dropped the knife, scrambling to relight the candle, my heart pounding wildly in my chest. I picked up the knife again as a terrible crash came from the corridor ahead, followed by a blood-curdling, inhuman howl. I froze, staring toward the end of the hallway. A massive window stood there, green light pouring in, and suddenly, a shape became clearer. It was undeniably human, but with elongated limbs and thin, spindly fingers. Its head was grotesquely distorted, a twisted caricature of a human face. I could make out thick lips that jutted too far from its face, gnarled teeth pushing through its gums, green, slanted eyes filled with hate, and thin strands of hair clinging to its swollen, misshapen head. The figure moved, then snarled. I gripped the candle tighter. "Larry," I turned around. It was Carlton's voice. "Larry," I spun sharply, looking back. It wasn't Carlton. I kept walking slowly, gripping the knife in my hand, as my friend's disembodied voice attacked me, repeating my name from a different spot each time. "Larry, Larry." I wanted to scream at it to go away, but I couldn't make a sound. If I did, I would break the rules. I just kept walking. Soon I turned right. There was a staircase. I started climbing the stairs when suddenly, a dusty glass bottle rolled down from above, slowly tumbling step by step. I stopped it with my foot and, noticing a faint inscription on it, quickly bent down and grabbed the bottle by the neck. I lifted it and brought it close to my face. "And one more thing, Larry. I knew it was a lie." I threw the bottle aside and continued up the stairs. At the top of the stairs, I saw a piece of paper taped to the wall. It read, "Larry, some of them are hiding in the basement. Josie will wake them up. Larry, she will scream, and they will awaken. Damn, If this wasn't a joke, Josie was in danger. I turned away from the wall and stepped onto the third floor. I had no idea how to find Carlton, just a feeling that he might be here. My phone buzzed. I quickly set the knife on the floor and pulled out my phone. A text from Benny. Guys, I found the basement door. It's blocked by 2 hospital beds. I'll move them and get Josie out. Don't make too much noise, or that lunatic might hear you, I replied. And then someone screamed. I froze, my eyes snapping away from the phone. I knew that voice. My blood ran cold as the screaming suddenly stopped. Only one thought raced through my mind. They have Greg. That's 2 down already. A voice whispered near my ear. 3 left, it giggled. You will lose the midnight game. I ignored it, yanked out my phone, and checked for messages. Nothing. I began typing frantically when my candle went out. In my panic, I dropped the knife and stuffed my phone away. I relit the candle just as I heard a sharp sound behind me. I will never forget what I saw. It was Carlton. His face was gaunt and pale, his eyes sunken deep, his hair streaked with gray. His arms were crossed over his body. I blinked in shock and fear, then rushed toward him, careful not to call his name out loud. Carlton didn't move, even as I hugged him, making sure not to burn him with the candle. Then he spoke. I felt my blood turn to ice. Larry, he said. It wasn't my friend's voice. It was something else, something wrong. I let go of Carlton and backed away, staring into his haunting eyes. Fear wrapped around me like a suffocating blanket. Run, Carlton whispered. Run, Larry. And I ran. I ran as hard as I could, refusing to stop for even a second, like a rat trapped between walls. I turned every corner recklessly, my breath ragged, my heart pounding. Words flashed by on the walls, painted in bright red. They are near. They are stirring. They are waking up. What happens when they wake up? I was sure my mind was just playing tricks on me. After minutes of sprinting, I stumbled into a room. In the center stood a rusted steel table. Moldy curtains hung limply around it. On a tray nearby lay a set of twisted, rust-covered surgical tools. The operating room, that's what this was. Something moved in the corner. A large rat, a big, black rat staring straight at me. It stood on its hind legs, twitching its nose, its front paws held up as if reaching for something. Then, it jerked and slipped through a hole in the wall. I still held the candle in my hand. I clenched it tighter, unwilling to take my eyes off the corner. The fifth voice spoke, right in my ear. How fascinating, isn't it? The voice murmured. A rat standing on its hind legs. Who do you think taught it that? Then silence. A warm gust of breath tickled my ear before the voice whispered again. Do you think you could fit into that hole if you tried? The rat appeared in the hole again, then suddenly sprang forward, dashing toward me across the floor. I nearly screamed when it reached my foot. Then it leapt into the air beside me and froze in the middle of the room, its claws gripping something I couldn't see. Oh dear, the fifth voice chuckled. That's my leg. Somehow, I could feel its unseen gaze locking onto me. Behind me, footsteps. Slow, shuffling, patient footsteps. A chilling voice whispered my name. Panic surged through me. I had to get out. But where? I knew I wouldn't fit through the rat hole. But I had to try, because the alternative was worse. I started kicking the wall. Luckily, it was drywall. After just 2 kicks, it began to crumble. A sharp squeak rang out behind me, and the rat scurried past my feet into the widened hole. I crawled in right after it. The space between the walls was tight, but just wide enough to move through. My candle illuminated my steps, keeping the rat in sight. When it rounded a corner, I followed. Then my phone rang. The rat stopped. turned, staring directly at me. I hesitated, then pulled out my phone. A message from Benny. Guys, I got Josie out of the basement. We're heading for the main exit. I can't find Greg or Carlton. What about you, Larry? The next message. Wait, I see Greg. He's in the West Wing. My eyes widened. I typed, Benny, don't go near Greg. Don't go near Carlton. Find somewhere to hide. I'll come to you. Josie replied almost instantly. Larry, what are you talking about? I started typing, and then a scream. A monstrous, inhuman wail, echoing from below. The rat squealed, and then footsteps, heavy, approaching from beneath me. A slow, distant voice drifted through the space behind me. Larry, I'm coming. I glanced at the rat, then shoved my phone away. I reached for my knife and realized I had left it on the floor. The voice spoke again, closer now. Larry, I'm coming. The rat bolted. I ran after it. We moved through the narrow passage until a hole in the floor. It didn't look deep. I jumped. The impact sent sharp pain shooting through my legs. I hissed through clenched teeth and quickly relit my candle, scanning my surroundings. A room bathed in eerie green light. I reached for the door, and it swung open on its own. Beyond it, an empty hallway. I exhaled in relief, and then my candle went out again. I didn't panic when my candle went out. Honestly, I was used to it by now, and relighting it wasn't difficult. From the very beginning of the game, I had to do this constantly, so practice had made it easier. One strike, the match ignited. In the dim light coming from the hallway a few meters ahead, I suddenly saw, probably, the same rat I had been chasing. I have to admit, it didn't seem entirely normal. Something was definitely off about it. Then again, after everything that had happened, very little could truly surprise me anymore. The rat watched me light the candle with an almost human-like patience. When I finished, its nose twitched, and it took off down the corridor again. Without further hesitation, I followed, closing the door behind me. Felt strange following a rat. There was a sense of purpose in its movements, as if it was leading me somewhere intentionally. Every step it took was so certain, so deliberate, that much to my shame, I found myself almost envying it. The green light outside seemed darker now, like it was fading. Passing by a window, I glanced outside. The world was still the same, gray, barren, lifeless. My phone buzzed. I pulled it from my pocket. A message from Josie. Larry, where the hell? I lost Benny. You were right, something's wrong with Greg. And there are rats everywhere. I've never seen rats this big before. I replied immediately, listen, I think the rats are on our side. Got it? So I don't know how to say this. Just don't be afraid of them. A new message popped up, this time from Benny. Josie, Larry, thank God you're okay. Listen, I'm following one of the rats right now. Guys, do you know what time it is? I glanced at the top of my phone screen. What the hell? The time wasn't displayed. I had no idea what that meant, but an uneasy feeling settled deep in my gut. The phone I had checked so often now felt distant, unreliable. What if this world was just as unstable as our technology? A scream echoed from the hallway. I jumped, nearly dropping my candle, and spun around. Another message came through. Did you guys hear that? Yeah, I replied. What was that? Or rather, who was that? I froze, realizing I had no idea who I was actually talking to. My thumb hovered over the keyboard, paralyzed. Another message appeared. Who is it? It was from Josie's number. The next message answered her question. Greg. My tongue felt like sandpaper, my mouth suddenly dry. Another inhuman wail tore through the air, followed by the sound of rushing footsteps. Something tugged at my pant leg. I looked down. The rat. It stared up at me, eyes wide and frantic, then turned its head toward the far end of the corridor. I followed its gaze. From the shadows at the end of the hall came the crunch of shattered glass. Then a ragged voice rasped my name. The rat bolted in the opposite direction. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran after it. The moment the door ahead of us swung open, I dove inside, the rat slipping through just before the door slammed shut behind us. I knew damn well that whoever it was, whatever it was, it would find me. I had to barricade the door. Frantically, I scanned the room for a chair, a cabinet, anything I could use. A sharp squeak snapped my attention back to the rat. It was perched on top of an operating table. Without hesitation, I shoved the heavy table toward the door and flipped it onto its side so the wheels wouldn't roll. As soon as it was pressed against the entrance, the rat squeaked again. It was pressing itself against an old wheelchair. I grabbed it and shoved it up against the overturned table, reinforcing my barricade. Then I crouched down, making sure my head wasn't visible through the door's single rectangular window. Soft, shuffling footsteps echoed in the hallway. I held my breath. I clenched the candle tightly, tilting it to cast as little light as possible. The steps were almost weightless, even as they reached the door. I glanced at the rat. Its small body rose and fell with rapid breaths. It was watching the door just like me. The footsteps stopped. A shadow passed over the dim light from outside. I heard breathing. Who was it? Carlton? Greg? The voice that spoke was low, flat, so devoid of emotion that I couldn't recognize it. And yet, I knew one thing. This voice had once belonged to a person. Larry, do you want to know where we are? I clenched my jaw and covered my mouth and nose with my hand. My heart hammered wildly in my chest. What nonsense! Larry, we never left Earth. A chill shot through me. We are still on our planet. We're just seeing it for what it truly is, what it has always been. This is how it looks when no one is paying attention. Human eyes have never noticed. They are always so blind to the way reality truly is, unable to see beyond their own arrogance. This is what life as a rat looks like. The doorknob trembled and began to turn slowly. The door shuddered as something slammed into it. The makeshift barricade rattled. Another hit, then another, and another. Felt like the barricade was about to collapse. "Open the door, Larry," the voice said. "Let me in." I shut my eyes. The voice kept talking. Then, in the distance, a scream. A woman's scream. "Oh God! That's not her. No, not her." And just like that, the shaking stopped. Shuffling footsteps receded, but the voice continued. "The midnight game is almost over. Very soon, all of this will end." I waited, not daring to move until the voice had completely faded away. Only then did I let myself breathe. The rat slipped from my grasp, climbed onto the barricade, and looked at me expectantly. Moving the table was harder than setting it up. By the time I managed to open the door, I couldn't help but notice. The light had changed again. It was less painful now, but still harsh to my eyes. I was about to follow the rat when a deep rumble shook the floor beneath me, like an earthquake, followed by a distant, metallic clatter, like chains being dragged across the ground. "What's happening?" I murmured, and then froze. The rat turned to stare at me. I had just broken the rules, hadn't I? I expected to hear a voice declare that I had become the third player to lose the midnight game, to feel hands grab my shoulders and drag me into the dark, to end up like Carlton and Greg. But nothing happened. I pulled out my phone, intending to message the others, but someone beat me to it. Not much time left. A distant crash echoed behind me, and suddenly, my phone screen flared to life. a cascade of flashing rainbow colors. I tried to turn it off, but no matter how long I held my finger on the power button, the screen refused to go dark. Gritting my teeth, I shoved the phone back into my pocket and turned to look at the rat. His head suddenly lifted, and it let out a piercing squeak. For a single heartbeat, the entire world fell silent. Then, the walls trembled, plaster cracked, and a flood of rats burst forth, pouring onto the floor. They moved in perfect formation, aligning themselves behind the one I had come to trust as my guide. All of them stood still, watching me. Then, the guide squeaked again. The rats began to move, mouths clamped onto tails, bodies twisting. I felt my breath hitch as I realized they were forming words. The midnight game is ending, they spelled out. Every rat, except for my guide, stood motionless as I read. What lies below is almost awake. Only 2 players remain. Another team is coming for you. The rats unraveled, shifting into a new phrase. Only one must survive to win the game. Find shelter until the game ends. My eyes widened. I shook my head, swallowing hard. The rats moved again. My guide remained still, its expression unchanged. Your friends can only return to normal if you survive. Death plays fair. I blinked, squinting in confusion. Then, a voice, distant, behind me. Ah, there you are. Tell me, have the rats already shared my title with you? Footsteps. From behind. I turned slowly. The shadows converged once more within the bright green glow. The shape they took now was nearly identical to the one I had seen before, but taller, thinner, more regal. The game is ending, the 5th voice spoke. At the far end of the hallway, the shadow stirred. 1 foot lifted from the ground, stepped forward. The other followed. The shadow walked. Now, I must take the game to the next level. Otherwise, I could hardly call myself the king of death. Could I? I turned. The other rats were gone. Only my guide remained. It had already leapt forward, scrambling up my leg when something grabbed my shoulders. I must admit, the voice said, I'm impressed by your resilience. For a player your age, you hold yourself remarkably well. Your composure, it's the challenge I've longed for. Please, when you're done screaming in fear, know this, I take no pleasure in losing a worthy opponent. Then, I was yanked backward. Everything turned black. I opened my eyes. Darkness. Then, a spark of light. Painful green. My eyes widened. A shape emerged in the glow. Then, something scurried onto my face. Tiny claws dug into my skin. A hairless tail draped over my cheek. Rat fur pressed against my eyes, blinding me. I felt its hot breath in my ear. Its whiskers twitched. Then, a roar. Deep, otherworldly. So distant it seemed to echo from the edge of the universe itself. Chains rattled. Another roar joined in. One I couldn't even begin to describe. Something I had never heard before. My ears rang. Something warm trickled from them. I shook. Winds howled, slamming into me, pushing me back. In a single heartbeat, cold turned to blistering heat. The rat squealed. Something grabbed my arm. Suddenly, I was falling. Then, a hard impact, flat on my back. The wind stopped. The green light was gone. I blinked. Above me, the rat stirred, moving sluggishly. I peeled it from my face, found myself staring up at the ceiling. And then, a shadow loomed over me. You survived, whispered the voice. I'm impressed. You're very lucky to have that rat with you. But the midnight game isn't over yet, Larry. We have 10 minutes left. It was at that moment that I realized death itself was speaking to me, and it smiled. Now is when the real fun begins. something landed on my chest. I grabbed it and brought it close to my face. Plump, orange candle. Light it, Death said, and light your own as well. In all my centuries of existence, I have learned every human fear. Now I will use that knowledge against you. So please light the candles. Don't disappoint me. Death smirked again. After all, it murmured, you are the last player on your team. Damn, I was the only one left. Only 10 minutes remained. I didn't light the second candle, just my own. Trying to keep track of 2 burning candles in my hands would have been more of a hindrance than an advantage. Death chuckled softly. I had clearly made an impression. To sacrifice an advantage that would turn into an obstacle for greater safety, it noted. Wait, if Death knew I'd figure out that trick, then it must have had a backup plan. I was already on my feet, gripping my candle tightly. All my friends stood nearby, silent. Wait, where was the rat? It was no longer by my side. I frantically glanced around, searching for my tiny savior, the one that had guided me through nearly the entire game. Then, I noticed Josie's face. Gray hair, sunken cheeks, pale skin, eyes hollow, caved in. She smiled so wide that it looked as if her skin might split open. Benny stood beside her. The only difference was that his skin was slightly lighter in shade. Greg and Carlton stood on either side of them. They were all smiling at me, smiling so wide their cheeks cracked. I nearly screamed. I thrust the candle out in front of me, a feeble shield. My friends took a step forward, then stopped, still smiling, not even blinking. Something slid past my neck. Slow, gentle. It brushed the back of my head. Warm breath swept over my ear. Thin, stiff whiskers tickled my shoulder. Allow me to show you, Death whispered, what it truly means to be afraid. I squeezed my eyes shut. Then, I heard them, my friends, wheezing, giggling hoarsely, dragging their feet. I opened my eyes. Josie's face, inches from the candle. I recoiled, nearly fell. For a moment, I thought I'd back straight into the thing behind me, but it didn't happen. I just kept retreating, further from my friends, until I hit a wall. Shit, where was the rat? My friends had stopped moving. A sickly green light slowly descended upon them. I lifted my head. The ceiling, holes. Through them I could see the sky, and in it, a green orb, like a sun, drifting, growing larger. Every second, I could see its surface, pulsing, like a heart. Then, the sun began to shrink, like it was collapsing inward. Then, in a blinding flash of light, it expanded. I shut my eyes, shielding myself from the glow. I knew it took 7 minutes for light from the sun to reach Earth. At first, this thought made me believe I was about to die. Then, I realized I must have already been dead. I looked up again. The sun hadn't changed. A pitiful trick, Death whispered. I admit, one day the sun your people orbit will die. It will consume your world. Will it be today? Tomorrow? While your grandchildren still live? Who knows? The shuffling in front of me caught my attention. My friends were moving again. I kept holding out my candle, keeping them at a distance, but it went out. I managed to relight it within seconds, but I couldn't take my eyes off them. Benny began separating from the group, stepping off to the side. I moved along the wall and stopped. Greg and Carlton slowly shuffled toward me. I shifted my gaze between them. Josie, Carlton, Greg, Benny, all of them staring at me, smiling wide, unblinking. And then, I realized something. None of them had attacked me. They had plenty of chances, but they never took them. Why? Unless Death needed me to scream, to give up. It didn't need to harm me. because forcing me to scream wouldn't be fair. That wouldn't be real fear, would it? I took a slow step forward. My friends stepped back. Another step. They retreated again. I kept walking, slowly, until I reached the spot where the plump, orange candle lay. I bent down, picked it up, lit it with my other candle, and set it at my feet. My friends were still smiling at me, but the fear of them was gone. "You understand," Death whispered. "You solved the mystery. Very perceptive. How strange for someone so young to be so insightful, so cunning, so composed." I tensed. "Why? Where did you get such a talent? Were you born with it?" Death let out a quiet chuckle. "Was it developed?" I spun around, scanning each grinning, hollow face. "Who nurtured your skills?" Death whispered. "Did they do it on purpose? Was it your parents?" A chill ran down my spine. Death had found an opening. "Do you love your parents? Do they know you're here? Do they know you're playing the midnight game?" I bit my lower lip, hard. A thin trickle of blood ran down my chin. "Careful," Death said. "No need to harm yourself." Then, a breath, close to my ear. "Have you ever wanted to kill someone?" I inhaled sharply. My breath caught in my throat. "Oh, Larry, does that scare you?" I couldn't answer. Death chuckled again. "I see. That's your fear, isn't it? Someone your age shouldn't have thoughts like that. And yet, it terrifies you. Deep down, you imagine finding the people who hurt you and taking their lives with your own hands. There is a darkness in your heart, one rarely found in someone so young." Silence. Then, a whisper. "I understand." In an instant, the room fell silent. The kind of silence that came when the midnight game began, when I couldn't hear my own breath or my own heartbeat. Then, laughter, warped, mocking, distorted. It was my laugh. I felt something slide over my shoulders. My hair didn't stand on end, but my skin prickled. Strange. I had been terrified when the game started, but after nearly an hour of fear, I no longer felt the urge to scream. Time flies, but it is inevitable. Soon enough, the hollow threat of fear will lose its power. There is only one way left, Larry. Something grabbed my shoulder. I spun around instantly, but there was nothing there. Just narrow, bony knuckles and fingers tipped with black claws. "Feed your fear." I was yanked back and thrown to the ground with ease. The candle slipped from my hands. It went out instantly, and what I saw above me left me in shock. A gray, grotesque man. His lips cracked in several places, revealing jagged, crooked teeth, rows of them growing out of his gums. Two fiery red eyes bore down on me. I had only seen his head, and already my courage was slipping away. "And now," Death said softly, crouching down. My friends stood behind her, moving in eerie, supernatural synchronization. And at last, I saw something in their empty eyes. The same thing I saw in Death's. That same tiny glimmer. Her lips didn't move as she spoke. "The game is ending." Her gaze locked onto mine. I felt invisible threads weaving between us. Like worms, they slipped through my eyelids and burrowed into my head. A scream rose in my throat. Then, the rat returned. First, I heard its sharp squeak. Then, a furious screech. And then, a deafening crash. Several doors I hadn't noticed before burst open. A man with a terrible beard stormed into the room, charging at the figures in front of me. Something black darted past his legs as he slammed into Greg and Josie. Death turned for a split second and vanished. "So close," she murmured, almost thoughtfully. "So close." And then, Greg's alarm went off. I can't fully explain what happened next. The entire Hammond Asylum began to shake. The walls seemed to collapse, fragments of the world itself breaking apart down to the atoms. Then, a pair of tiny feet scurried up my arm, crossed my face, blocking my vision. The rat leapt off, and suddenly we were back in the room where it all began. Everyone was unconscious, and I was the only one who saw it. Their candles had burned down completely. All that remained were puddles of hardened wax on the floor. I had to wait for them to wake up. When they did, none of them remembered the midnight game, or what happened after their candles went out. And I never told them about the horrors I had seen. As we left, I kept looking back. Graffiti and scribbles on the walls, left behind by other visitors, reminded me that we weren't the first to come here, and we weren't the first to leave. I know I didn't imagine it. Even now, at night, I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, afraid to fall asleep. As we stepped out of the asylum, my mind drifted to Josie, and honestly, there was never anything between us. We were just kids, and we remained just friends. Even though they don't remember what happened during the midnight game, I felt like somehow it brought us closer, made our bond stronger. I couldn't have been the only one who noticed, but they never said a word about it.